So welcome everyone to our second monthly issue from the Blue Sustainability and Society Initiative. This month we're talking about sea ice, and I'm really pleased this month to be joined by Isabel Realyvasquez, who is a PhD student in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. So welcome. We're very pleased to have you. Um, I wonder if you could give a brief overview to the viewers of your PhD project as a whole.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. My work at the moment is really looking at 18th century and Romantic British literature, mostly poetry. I'm interested in ecological thinking, particularly in the colonial Caribbean. So quite different than thinking about sea ice, but
Mm,
those kinds of extremes are things that I'm quite interested in. So I look at Georgic and pastoral poetry, ranging from poets like James Thompson to Wordsworth. I'm especially interested in plantation poetry, so thinking about James Granger's The Sugarcane. And yeah, I'm broadly, my interests are about how poetry can register environmental changes and be thinking about human, non-human entanglements
mm,
in these colonial spaces.
mm. And how did you get onto your work on James Cook in particular?
Yeah, I took a graduate seminar in 18th century British literature and empire, and in that class we had to read James Granger's, or not James Granger, James Cook's journals in their abridged form because unabridged they're just like so massive.
Mm,
But it was interesting. I kind of thought I knew who he was. I was like, oh, I know this guy, I know his story. So I kind of, I guess, came into that work with a bit of a bias, thinking
mm,
there's nothing new or interesting to find here. But it was really coming across his Antarctic journey journals and his journeys there that kind of shocked me. I guess it was like one of these times where I just like was so absorbed in what I was reading, because a lot of his Pacific travels can kind of seem very repetitive. I mean, he goes across these Pacific islands, he encounters people. He, trades with them if things go well, and he shoots at
mm,
them if things don't go well, and then he sails on. But in the Antarctic Circle, this narrative pattern kind of collapses when he comes across sea ice that's crowding around him. So this actually drew my attention less from the tropics and to these colder polar spaces. And just kind of, I was interested in the way in which um, it was kind of made strange to me. I
mm,
feel I grew up thinking about the Antarctic and the polar regions in general as these kinds of fragile spaces,
mm,
because I grew up and everyone's talking about the Doomsday Glacier and how ice is melting. And so coming across Cook's journals and his encounters with sea ice, I was like, this is almost like science fiction, like coming across like ice where it's not fragile, but actually is like very like rebuffing colonial expansion. So it
mm,
was it was a happy surprise, I guess, to me in terms of encountering his journals in that light.
mm. So, in a way, your work is was partly informed by um, climate change today, but you've somehow um, sort of seen the potential positives
Yeah,
and hope that is present in Cook's journals in a way.
definitely. Yeah, I think, kinds of I see kind of his travels as kickstarting kind of this time of climate change in some
Mm,
ways. If we think about, his encounter in Antarctica or in the Pacific Islands in general as kickstarting colonialism and then
mm,
globalization, capitalism, now Anthropocene. But it's that initial encounter, I think, to me, that kind of acts as an opportunity to see things differently.
mm. And I think one theme that emerges from I suppose Cook's journals and what you've teased out of his journal, is the agency that this sea ice has. You describe it as having a material force, I think, and this sort of constrains his travels. And then in contrast, you look at the Yagan people of Patagonia, and they have this respect for the power of sea ice. And I wonder, as a literary studies sort of come historian, what contributions can or imbuing sea ice with agency and also breaking rigid human non-human distinctions? What do you think that might bring to discussions on climate science and climate policy today?
Yeah, I mean it's a great question.
Mm,
I think there are many thinkers who have kind of done this work that I've been interested in and thinking about, what we might consider inert matter as actually having agency. So I think of like Bruno Latour.
mm,
Um, and in terms of ice in particular, I've been thinking about Olivier Rameau's Thinking Like an Iceberg and Julie Cruikshank's Do Glaciers Listen? And she in particular is really interesting for looking at glacial ice as something that Native Athabascan people in Alaska and the Yukon territories consider as, living and how it is significant to their language and to their cosmologies, and it plays an active role in their
mm,
lives. And Olivier Rameau has this wonderful moment in Thinking Like an Iceberg, where he talks about icebergs calving and like calving as a process of giving birth, kind of like whales, and how we can trace a genealogy of parent and child within what is seemingly inert matter.
mm,
So all this kind of helped me think about ice as being rather than as object.
mm,
Um, and so, but I think as well it was important for me to look at these indigenous stories, and particularly the Yagan, who Cook had encountered, but who he kind of dismissed them as, not really having a valuable viewpoint. But in the stories that I read, they do see ice as person.
mm,
And I think this was interesting, and it's interesting to think about in relation to climate policy, because I don't think it's as much about re-imbuing ICE with agency, but
mm,
rather understanding that there are people for whom that's always been their reality, that ICE has
mm,
always had that agency. And actually, what's obscured us from seeing that reality is colonialism and kind of projecting our way of thinking against that way of thinking.
mm,
So yeah, I think in terms of climate policy, I guess maybe it's affording those voices
mm,
um, to kind of show or inflect what that local knowledge has done for them, and maybe in some ways we can translate that to more global policy.
mm,
I think the major thing I see with seeing ICE as agent is that it affords our affective response to be one of care, maybe.
mm,
Um, I think of um, the recent happenings in New Zealand, where they recently granted a river personhood, legal
mm,
personhood, and rights. And I wonder if that could happen for an iceberg. I don't know. Maybe
mm,
the question of travel and drift is something that kind of negates that. But this sense of collective responsibility for something, I think, allows us to have more of a stake in it, and one that's not just tied to melting ice, but actually more of a care for a being, kind of like an
mm,
endangered species in this way, where we want to protect it, but we also realize it has a life of its own. So kind of that sweet spot of both care and respect to kind of have our own distance from it.
mm. Yeah, I really like the idea of caring for this sort of being of ice that sort of has a maybe mind of its own of some in some way. Talking about sort of minds, I think another theme that emerges is psychology, and the psychological force of sea ice on the colonial mind and obviously James Cook's mind. I wonder if you could tell us what those psychological emotional impacts on Cook were.
Yeah, I think the most interesting thing to me in terms of the psychology of the colonial mind in these polar spaces is this feeling of being surrounded. There are many moments where Cook is meticulously recording all these moments of encountering sea ice, the way it crowds around the ship, um, and the way in which many of his crew go off into these smaller boats and they try and take off some of they chip away at the ice
Mm,
for fresh water. So there's already a certain sense of like reliance on it, but also it's thwarting their passage. That's a kind of strange relationship there. But also at the level of the body, there are all these moments where, like ice and frost is coating the body and their hair,
mm,
and the ship's sails and rigging or turns, he says it turns to metal. So there's all these ways in which the world is made strange, how it's kind of surrounding, almost consuming him. And that idea of consumption is really the psychological factor that I'm interested in
mm,
because so much of Cook's scholarship is interested in this idea of consumption between humans, like cannibalism, and um, I think ice does a similar, sea ice in particular, does a very similar act of consumption, at least in terms of at the psychological level, where the sense of crowding icebergs, and then he goes to these tropical regions and he lands on these islands. He feels that same overwhelming force of crowding by native people. And I'm kind of interested in the way in which we can see these senses of crowding that first arise in the Antarctic
mm,
as a way in which it kind of changes the colonial mindset towards other people,
mm,
towards what maybe for them they once considered object or as something to kind of exert mastery over. Instead, we see this kind of total obliteration of subject-object divide, or at least a reconfiguration of subjectivity for the
mm,
colonial mind. I'm interested in that way in which, for Cook, he sees himself occupying space differently in Pacific Islands after he was in the Antarctic region versus versus before, when he kind of has
mm,
this more strong sense of distance and space between, and the way in which sea ice and ice fields kind of collapse that space.
mm. I think reading your work, I was reminded of the way some psychologists today talk about the impact of climate change on people's psychology and mental health, and the idea of solastalgia, which this is this sort of grief, anxiety, or distress felt over climate change, and particularly in the communities that are most affected by it. And I wonder if there are, not to necessarily read back onto the past, but if there are some parallels there with Cook's own feelings and some of those psychological tendencies that people are noticing today.
Yeah, I think I don't know if it's exactly the same with Cook because I think a lot of his anxiety is about overcoming his climate rather
Mm,
than being subject to it. Um, I think, for him, it's all about having total mobility. Um, and so I think if our climate anxiety today is a symptom of living in the Anthropocene, I think that Cook's anxiety belongs more at the beginning of it. He's right there when it all kind of starts to unfold. I think there are other people of the time who are thinking of, climate anxiety in a similar way as we do today,
mm,
notably like in London with the pollution
mm,
of factories. But in terms of Cook getting away from all that and kind of being the open seas, I think there's still this sense of actually becoming a master of one's climate,
mm,
at least until he sees that there's this crowding of sea ice. But yeah, rather than feeling like, oh, we're doomed by it.
mm. I want to just you're also working on the tropics. I wonder
Mhm.
what Cook how that contrasts his perceptions of the tropics contrast with that of the Southern Ocean.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, there's no people in the Southern
Mm,
Ocean, and so I think immediately there's that kind of goal of that taxonomic or natural historian goal of kind of recording one's environment is now translated onto maybe less human objects and now to more the sea life around him. Um, and kind of, I guess, being more surprised by what he sees rather than
mm,
feeling of like, oh, this is not like the Tahitians and this is not like the Tongans, and having that more less comparisons, I guess. I mean, I was interested in the way in which he goes to the Southern Ocean and he's grappling for comparisons.
mm,
And oftentimes he thinks back to England actually and is thinking, oh, this iceberg looks like, St. Paul's Dome. And so he's trying to find more like domesticating ways
mm,
to kind of claim some of his own agency on the ice. But yeah, in comparison to the tropics, I think the lack of human element, I think, is already kind of it makes him rely, I guess, more on the ship, and
mm.
everything kind of turns to the ship itself rather than what he sees from it necessarily.
Right. That makes sense. Um, as one final fun question, as a sort of thought experiment, I wonder what you might say Cook would have thought about sort of destruction of the cryosphere today if he could have seen or experienced it. What would his thoughts be?
I mean, I would like to say that he'd probably be like all of us kind of devastated, but
Mm,
I think he'd be pretty pleased in the
mm,
sense of having that passage, the free passage.
mm,
I think his mind would be blown by seeing the tourist ships that can now just swim
mm,
where you go and kind of coast off Antarctica and the scientific sites that have been established on the continent. I think he'd be pretty mind blown.
mm,
Knowing that now you can traverse the Northwest Passage, maybe he'd be mad he wasn't the first to do it.
mm,
But yeah, I think probably if his goal was to kind of help establish more commercial networks, I think he'd probably still go for Panama Canal, which
mm.
go back to the tropics in terms
Yeah.
of the place of trade rather than risk it in these icy waters.
Yeah. That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Isabel, for talking to
Thank
us
you.
today. We're so pleased to have you.